Tonight, you'll be stepping into the boots of a real Old West sheriff. Not the Hollywood kind, but the quiet kind who drank his coffee black, walked dusty streets with steady eyes, and kept peace with a badge, a revolver, and a whole lot of patience. Like and subscribe if you enjoy slow stories with real history, subtle humour, and good old-fashioned law and order. He woke before the rooster. Not because he was especially eager to greet the day, but because the floorboards under his cot creaked every time the wind changed direction, and the wind in Kansas never could make up its mind. Dust drifted in through the gap beneath the door as it always did, settling gently across the toes of his boots, which waited by the bed like a pair of loyal dogs. The sheriff sat up slowly, stretching until his shoulders popped. 42 years old, with knees that remembered every mile of horseback riding he'd done since the war. He'd come west with hopes of owning land. Instead, he'd inherited the badge after the last sheriff decided he'd rather run a dry goods store in Wichita. Less bullets, he'd said. Hard to argue with the logic. The sheriff dressed without ceremony, worn long johns, cotton shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, heavy canvas trousers, belt already bowed from use. His hat hung by the door, broad-brimmed and sun-faded, with a slight indentation from where his niece back in Missouri had stuck a feather during her visit 2 summers ago. He never took the feather out. Made him look like he had a touch of personality. He stepped outside into the grey dawn. The air was dry and sharp, and the wide sky was the colour of old tin. Main Street was quiet, save for the snorting of horses from the livery, and the slow churn of a windmill a few blocks down. The town, still young enough to be called the settlement by folks passing through, had just under 300 people if you included the goat who routinely wandered into the saloon. He walked to the jailhouse, which doubled as his office and tripled as the town's unofficial meeting hall. The sign above the door, hand-painted and slightly crooked, read, "Sheriff's Office and Jail." Someone had tried to draw a star next to it, but gave up halfway through. It looked more like a potato. Inside, it smelled faintly of kerosene and pencil shavings. 2 cells, 1 desk, 1 chair, a stove, and a cot for when nights ran long. 1 prisoner snored gently behind bars. A ranch hand who'd over-enjoyed his winnings in a poker game the night before. The sheriff noted the bottle still clutched in the man's hand and made a mental note to check if it was his 3rd or 4th visit. 5th visit meant a talk. 6th meant writing to his sister. He lit the stove, brewed a pot of coffee thick enough to clean a rifle barrel, and sat at his desk with a sigh. On the wall beside him hung a wanted poster for a man named Slim Johnny Tramble. The drawing looked more like Abraham Lincoln after a bad night. Most did. No one in town had ever seen Slim Johnny, and frankly, the sheriff suspected he didn't exist. But it was good for morale to have a villain on paper. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the town had started to stir. A few wagons rattled past. Children ran barefoot down the street. Miss Delaney, who ran the boarding house, waved from her porch, an offer of breakfast if he wanted it. He tipped his hat, maybe later. But first there were boots to polish, a telegraph to check, and the small matter of 2 brothers arguing over the ownership of a pig. It was going to be one of those days. He kept the badge in the top drawer of his desk, not out of sentiment, but because the pin had a habit of snagging on his shirt if he wasn't careful. The star-shaped tin thing looked official enough, though it had been dulled by years of dust, rain, and the occasional incident involving spilled molasses. He gave it a brief polish with his sleeve before fastening it to his chest. It sat just above his heart. Not that it provided much in the way of protection. Most bullets didn't pause out of respect. The badge came with the job, and the job came with expectations, not all of them written down. Sure, the town council had given him a printed sheet once, listing duties like maintain public order and oversee all local detentions. But what they didn't include were the things he actually did most days. Mediating livestock disputes, breaking up card game fistfights, tracking down runaway horses, helping the widow Dunleavy move firewood, and occasionally calming down a travelling preacher who'd taken issue with the volume of the saloon's piano. It was a job of hats. Not the kind on his head, but the kind you wear without knowing you're wearing them. Lawman, counsellor, judge, sometimes undertaker, once, briefly, midwife. That was a complicated Tuesday. The badge didn't grant much power. In truth, it carried more responsibility than authority. He couldn't force people to listen. But in a town this small, everyone knew your name, and whether you were fair or just fast with a gun. He tried to be the former. The latter had a shorter career path. He'd been offered a deputy once. Young fellow from Topeka who said he wanted to live on the edge. The sheriff told him the edge was mostly splinters and bad coffee, and the boy left within a week, having stepped in a horse trough twice, and confused a chicken thief for the mayor. It was an honest mistake. They looked surprisingly alike from the back. Sometimes when trouble brewed, he wondered if he should have followed the cattle trail instead, or taken that job guarding railroad payrolls down south. But then he'd see the kids chasing each other around the water barrel or get a nod from Old Man Crick at the blacksmith's forge, and he'd remember why he stayed. The badge wasn't much, but it meant something here. It meant you didn't walk away when things got messy. It meant people trusted you to show up, even when the only reward was a cold plate of beans and a stiff back. On the wall of the office, behind the wanted posters and a map of the county with more holes than information, hung a small photograph. His predecessor, Sheriff Amos Lane. Amos had served 12 years, retired with all his fingers, and now owned the quietest hardware store west of the Mississippi. The sheriff looked at the photo for a moment and offered a nod, like a silent check-in between old souls who had once walked the same beat. Then he stood up, adjusted the badge so it sat straight, and walked outside into the rising heat. A man was waving his arms near the barber's shop, shouting something about a stolen saddle. Another was trying to hitch a stubborn mule to a wagon. A few children were daring each other to touch the church bell. Just another morning in a town with more problems than postage stamps. He took his breakfast at the same place every morning, a small clapboard building with a lopsided sign that read, Mildred's Cookhouse, though no one could remember the last time Mildred had actually cooked anything. These days it was run by her niece Ella, who had a scar on her left hand from a stove explosion, and a voice sharp enough to shoo flies out the door without lifting a finger. The sheriff stepped inside, nodded to the handful of early risers already seated, and claimed his usual table by the window. From there, he could watch the town come alive. Horses being saddled, porch brooms swishing dust into the air, shopkeepers lifting shutters, and occasionally a man trying to remember where he'd left his boots the night before. Ella brought him the usual without asking. 1 tin plate with 2 biscuits, eggs fried hard, a piece of ham thin enough to read a Bible verse through, and a cup of coffee so strong it could unclog a chimney. He ate in quiet, one hand always near the edge of the table. Not out of paranoia, just habit. Old instincts from the war and from earlier years when lawmen weren't guaranteed a full breakfast, or even a full morning. Strapped across his waist, just beneath the edge of his long coat, rested a Colt single-action army revolver. The Peacemaker, they called it. 6 rounds, 45 caliber, worn smooth from years of being drawn, reholstered, and sometimes placed gently on the table during more persuasive conversations. He cleaned it every Sunday, whether he fired it or not. He didn't like using it. In fact, he'd gone 3 months without pulling the trigger. The last time had been outside the livery, when a drifter from Nebraska thought shooting a whiskey bottle off a fence post was a good idea. The sheriff didn't shoot to kill, just took the man's hat off clean and let the wind carry it down Main Street like a tumbleweed with a sense of shame. Still, the gun was necessary. In this part of Kansas, not everyone respected a badge, but most respected a man who knew how to use a Colt and chose not to. That restraint was its own kind of power. The sheriff figured justice wasn't about being the fastest draw. It was about being the one who could still sleep at night. He finished his meal slowly, savouring the last sips of coffee, while Ella berated a ranch hand for dripping mud across her clean floorboards. The sheriff smiled behind his cup. Nothing settled a town like a woman who ran her kitchen like a court of law. As he stepped outside, full and moderately caffeinated, the sun had begun to rise properly. Long shadows stretched across the street, and the wind carried the faint scent of horses, bread, and blacksmith coal. A man in a bowler hat tipped his head as he passed. A dog barked at a passing wagon wheel. The town had its rhythm, unpredictable, a little dusty, but strangely comforting. He paused a moment to check the revolver at his side, gently loosening it in the holster. Not out of fear, just preparation. After all, he wasn't paid to guess how the day would go, just to be ready when it did. Somewhere near the edge of town, a bell rang. Not church, not school. It was the telegraph office. A new message. That usually meant something important, or at the very least someone else's problem arriving by wire. He adjusted his hat, cracked his neck, and started walking. He returned to the jailhouse just after 8, his boots leaving faint impressions in the dusty street. The heat was already building, turning the morning into that familiar western mix of dry air and sun glare. He pushed open the door with a shoulder, the bell above it giving a tired rattle. Less of a jingle and more of a suggestion that the door had moved. Inside, the jailhouse was dim and cool. The stone walls, hauled in from a quarry 4 miles north, held back the sun better than most of the buildings in town. A pot of coffee, left to simmer on the stove, had begun to smell more like burnt beans than brew, and a few flies orbited it as if paying their respects. He crossed to the cells with the slow, practiced gait of someone who didn't expect trouble, but never quite ruled it out. The drunk from the night before, Henry Tallow, a rail worker with an inconsistent relationship to sobriety, was still asleep on the cot, one arm slung across his chest and the other dangling limply between the bars. His boots were missing. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. That was new. A glance at the corner of the cell revealed the culprit, a small, scruffy dog curled up with one of the boots like it was a pillow. The dog looked up, blinked, and then went back to sleep. Henry stirred but did not wake, muttering something about a card game and the president's beard. The sheriff left him be. There was no use waking a man who hadn't yet remembered he was in jail. He sat behind the desk and thumbed through the overnight log, mostly quiet. A minor dispute between 2 drovers over a miscounted herd, a report of a loose cow wandering near the church, and, from the telegraph office, a forwarded message about a pair of counterfeit bills showing up in a town 2 counties east. That one he'd need to keep an eye on. He opened the strongbox under the desk, checked that the extra revolver and the ammunition belt were still accounted for, then pulled out a thin, leather-bound book, the official record ledger. The handwriting was uneven, some entries written neatly by candlelight, others scribbled in a hurry during less peaceful moments. He flipped back to 3 nights ago, when someone had broken into the general store and made off with 2 tins of tobacco, a sack of flour, and, most curiously, a wooden stool. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, just a trail of flour leading out the back door and vanishing by the creek. The stool's purpose remained unclear. He had half a theory it was being used as firewood, but part of him liked to imagine it now sat proudly in a camp somewhere, serving as a throne for the most dignified tobacco thief in the West. He made a note to follow up on it again, not because he expected to find the culprit, but because unfinished business tended to rattle around in his brain like a loose bullet in a drawer. Henry groaned from the cell. The sheriff looked over. "You're in jail," he said helpfully. Henry blinked. "Again?" "Yes." "Do I at least get breakfast?" "You do, if you can convince Ella to give you any." Henry laid back down with a theatrical sigh, as if the full weight of the law had just crushed his spirit. The sheriff chuckled under his breath and turned back to the ledger. A quiet jailhouse was always a temporary condition. But for now, the bars held, the records were up to date, and the strongest smell in the room was burnt coffee, which in his line of work was practically peace. He had never imagined that wearing a badge would involve so much writing, and not the kind that carried weight in courtrooms or carved names into history. Mostly it was ink smudged across fingers as he documented mule thefts, misplaced shipments of flour, or whether the barber's chair had been tampered with again, which it had, by a boy with too much time and not enough chores. The sheriff sat at his desk with a fountain pen that barely held ink, and a growing stack of correspondence. The morning sun filtered through the slats of the window, striping his papers like the bars in the holding cells behind him. He'd once considered moving the desk closer to the light, but after watching a black widow spider set up residence near the windowsill, he decided against it. They seemed to have an understanding now. He didn't disturb her, and she kept the mosquitoes away. On his desk, among the usual forms and blotter sheets, sat a fresh stack of wanted posters. They arrived once a week by stagecoach, bundled tight with twine and smelling faintly of whiskey, gunpowder and printer's ink. He untied the package with the same curiosity one might reserve for a deck of poorly drawn playing cards. First up, Harlan Pike, wanted for stage robbery in Utah Territory. The drawing looked like a goat that had lost a bet. The sheriff studied it for a moment, then pinned it to the wall with a nail that had already outlived its usefulness. Next came Luther Smoke Carrow, whose offences included cattle rustling, intimidation, and confusingly impersonating a priest. That one earned a raised eyebrow. He pinned it up next to the others, forming what passed for the town's rogues gallery, a grim collection of moustaches and inaccuracies. He sometimes wondered how many of these men still walked free, blending into other towns, growing beards, changing names. Out here, distance was safety. You could vanish in a day if you had a horse and a head start. Law enforcement was as much about patience as pursuit. He turned to the paperwork, a half-completed report about a damaged fence line, a letter from the county judge asking for updates on a court date that hadn't been set because the defendant was currently hiding in his mother's barn, and a petition from 4 citizens demanding the saloon be shut down on Sundays, which had been signed in the saloon itself, likely after a few rounds. He filled in what he could, leaving the rest for when he had more patience or fewer distractions. Justice moved slow, like everything else out here, not because it wasn't urgent, but because there weren't enough hands to move it faster. From the corner, Henry the prisoner mumbled something about needing water. The sheriff poured a ladleful from the jug and passed it through the bars without looking up. Henry, still shoeless, grunted his thanks and returned to sulking. The sheriff leaned back, stretched his arms, and let the chair creak beneath him. For all its tedium, the paperwork served a purpose. It gave structure to chaos, even if that structure was mostly handwritten and coffee-stained. Besides, he figured every sheet of paper filled was a problem dealt with, or at least delayed respectfully. Outside, he heard hooves on dirt and the sound of someone calling his name. Probably the deputy from over in Wallace County, or perhaps just a man looking for directions. Either way, it was time to stand up again. The wanted posters fluttered behind him, stirred by a breeze through the door. By late morning, the sun had taken full command of the sky, baking the rooftops and turning the street into a shimmering ribbon of dust and distant curses. He stepped outside the jailhouse just as a familiar voice called out from down the street. "Sheriff, we got a situation at the Bucket." The Bucket of Blood Saloon, or simply the Bucket, was the town's preferred establishment for poor decisions and occasional musical ambition. The name wasn't meant to be ironic. A decade earlier, during a particularly memorable poker game, someone had actually bled into a spittoon. They changed the name after that. It had a certain marketing charm, if not sanitation. He walked the block slowly, boots crunching over dry dirt and the occasional horseshoe nail. A dog barked half-heartedly from under a porch. A group of women paused their conversation outside the dressmaker's to see what sort of law was needed today. He tipped his hat politely, though the sun had already stolen most of the charm from the gesture. The saloon doors swung open just as he arrived, and out stumbled a man named Hank Tiller, a freighter known more for his size than his sense. He clutched his eye and muttered something about an unprovoked slap with a deck of cards. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer, sweat and wood polish, which was mostly spilled whiskey pretending to be polish. 2 men stood squared off in the centre of the floor. One had a split lip, the other had a shirt that was now missing most of its buttons. Between them, a card table had been upturned, its contents scattered like kindling across the floor. At the bar, the barkeep was calmly polishing a glass, clearly unimpressed. He'd seen better fights between old ladies over church pews. The sheriff stepped in and let the doors swing shut behind him with a soft creak. The room quieted a little, not out of fear, but out of familiarity. When the sheriff walked into a room, folks generally paused long enough to consider whether they were doing something arrestable. "What's the issue?" he asked, voice calm, boots planted. "He accused me of cheating," said the split lip. "He was cheating," said the buttonless one. The sheriff looked down at the scattered cards. Most were face up, including 3 aces that had somehow all been tucked into the same man's sleeve. He raised an eyebrow. "Well," he said dryly, "either you're unlucky or he's a magician." Buttonless scowled. Split lip looked embarrassed. The sheriff picked up one of the cards, turned it over and tucked it into his pocket. "Evidence," he said, though really he just liked to collect things that told stories. He motioned to the barkeep. "Was it violent?" "Loud," the barkeep shrugged, "but nothing broke, except pride." He nodded, then turned to the pair. "You two can settle your differences outside, with words, not fists, or I can cool you off in the jailhouse for an hour while your egos heal." The men hesitated. Jail wasn't terrible, but it was dull. Worse than that, it was public, and no one liked being seen behind bars unless they had a compelling reason and a dramatic nickname. They grumbled an agreement, dusted off their hats, and trudged out the side door, the one that creaked so loudly it sounded like judgment itself. The sheriff turned back to the bar. "Anything else?" "Just the piano," said the barkeep. He looked. One of the legs had cracked, likely kicked during the commotion. It now leaned gently to the left like it was tired of trying. He sighed. "I'll send word to the carpenter." Back outside, the sun hadn't let up. He paused for a moment under the overhang, letting the shade give him a moment of mercy. Another dispute handled. No bullets fired, no bones broken. That counted as a win. Even in the West, some problems could be solved by showing up with a badge, a calm voice, and the patience to let 2 men embarrass themselves just enough to walk away. After the saloon incident had been dealt with and the piano's injury formally reported, he decided to make his rounds. Not the official ones, like checking the jailhouse or filing reports with the county, but the kind that actually kept the town stitched together. Conversation, observation, a presence, visible but not intrusive, like the sun hanging over Main Street. He started with the blacksmith's forge, where Old Man Crick was halfway through hammering a horseshoe into submission. The forge spat heat into the morning, glowing orange like a stove that had found purpose. Crick had been working metal for 40 years, though no one could remember where he'd learned. Some said he'd trained in St. Louis. Others insisted he'd once shod cavalry horses during the war. Crick never corrected anyone. He just kept hammering. "Sheriff," Crick said, wiping sweat from his brow. "You hear about Mrs. Talbot's rooster?" He hadn't. "Pecked a man clean off his porch yesterday. Traveller tried to feed it corn. Bird took offence." The sheriff nodded solemnly. "Any charges?" "Only pride. Bird's fine. Travellers walking with a limp and a new respect for poultry." Further down the street, Miss Delaney was pruning her garden with the kind of intensity usually reserved for knife fights. She greeted him with a wave of her shears and launched into a tale about how her azaleas were being sabotaged by someone, or something, at night. Possibly raccoons, possibly her neighbour, whom she suspected of harbouring botanical jealousy. The sheriff listened, nodded in the right places and offered to set a trap. She declined. "If it's raccoons, they deserve the blooms more than I do," she muttered. Outside the general store, a group of men sat on crates and barrels, whittling sticks into things that might eventually be tools, or might just be smaller sticks. They spoke of rainfall, which had been pitiful, of rail lines which were rumoured to be expanding, and of a man in Abilene who'd claimed to invent a fireless stove. "He's just lazy," one of them said, calling it innovation. They welcomed the sheriff with nods, and he lingered for a while, enjoying the rhythm of it, the way stories passed from one mouth to the next, growing slightly taller with each retelling. It was frontier alchemy, fact into folklore. He heard about a preacher who'd arrived in town with a tent and a sermon, only to lose both in a windstorm. About a woman who claimed her mule could count to 5, though it mostly just kicked things in groups. And about a boy who'd found a tooth in the riverbed, swore it was from a dinosaur and was now charging a nickel for folks to look at it. The tooth, it turned out, belonged to a horse, but the boy was making more money than the barber, so no one pressed the issue. These stories weren't in any ledger or court record, but they were the true shape of the town, a strange dusty harmony of stubbornness and imagination. The sheriff didn't contribute much to the chatter. He just absorbed it, filing away details and voices like mental landmarks. By midday the air had grown thick, and the wind carried a faint scent of sagebrush and baking bread. He tipped his hat to the whittlers, promised Miss Delaney he'd keep an eye on her azaleas, and stepped back into the flow of the street. The town wasn't big. A man could walk its length in 10 minutes, but it held more lives than could be counted, each one spinning its own quiet drama beneath the same hot sky. And as sheriff, he didn't need to know everything, just enough to keep the peace and the stories going. He heard the deputy coming before he saw him. The hoofbeats weren't rushed, but they had that offbeat rhythm of a horse carrying a rider who'd been in the saddle too long and maybe too far. The sheriff turned toward the edge of town where the horizon shimmered like water on hot tin. From the blur of heat and dust a rider emerged, slouched slightly, hat tilted too far back, one hand loosely on the reins. Deputy Carter wasn't a bad deputy, just a young one, full of stories and suspicion, and still a little too impressed by the badge he wore. He'd been a school teacher back in Illinois, until the schoolhouse burned down. By accident, according to him, though details were thin. Now he patrolled the outskirts of town on a roan mare named Mabel, who had better instincts than her rider. The sheriff leaned against a hitching post as Carter pulled up, dismounted with a grunt, and brushed dust from his shirt as if it were an enemy that might strike again. "Morning, Sheriff," Carter said. "Long ride. Found something strange out near Dry Creek." The sheriff waited. With Carter, stories were best received in full before interrupting. "Campfire remnants," Carter continued. "Fresh. Maybe a day old. Big boot prints. Someone's been sleeping out there." "That's not unusual," the sheriff said. "Plenty of travellers between here and Wallace County." "Yeah, but this one left behind a trail. Broken branches, cigarette ends, even a brass button." He reached into his pocket and handed over the button like it might solve a crime all by itself. The sheriff turned it over in his hand. Dull, military-style, standard issue from at least 10 years ago. Could have come from any surplus jacket west of the Missouri. "Think it's anything?" Carter asked, eyes sharp. The sheriff tucked the button into his coat. "I think it's someone passing through who doesn't know how to clean up after themselves." Carter looked mildly deflated. He'd hoped for something more dramatic. Maybe a fugitive, maybe a legend in the making. But the sheriff had learned that most mysteries started big and ended with someone looking for a warm place to sleep and a cheap meal. Still, he appreciated the report. Carter, for all his bluster, paid attention, and out here, attention could be the difference between a town that thrived and one that faded off the map. They walked together toward the jailhouse. Mabel followed at a leisurely pace, stopping to sniff a rain barrel along the way. Carter rattled off the rest of his ride, a rancher missing a calf, a broken fence post along the North Trail, a man claiming he'd seen smoke signals, though it turned out to be the chimney from a travelling tinker's cart. Inside, the sheriff poured them each a cup of water, then sat and updated the ledger. Carter leaned in the doorway, watching the street, occasionally tipping his hat at passers-by. He had the energy of someone trying hard not to fidget. "You think I should ride out again?" Carter asked. "Tomorrow," the sheriff said. "Get some sleep. You look like your eyes are held open by spite." Carter grinned, then yawned. "Reckon you're right." The sheriff nodded. "And leave Mabel with the stable boy. She looks like she's ready to file a complaint." Carter chuckled, gave the mare a scratch behind the ear and ambled off. The sheriff sat for a moment in the quiet. The button still rested in his coat pocket. Maybe nothing, maybe not. He'd keep it. Not because he expected it to be important, but because sometimes the smallest things held the longest stories. And in a town like this, it paid to remember every clue. He rode out just after noon, when the heat had settled like a blanket over the plains, and the sky was so wide it made a man feel small in the best sort of way. His horse, a steady brown gelding named Jasper, didn't seem to mind the sun, but the sheriff kept a slow pace anyway. Not out of laziness, but because the prairie didn't reward speed, it rewarded awareness. His goal wasn't a destination so much as a direction. West, toward Dry Creek and the hills beyond. That was where Carter had found the campfire remains, the trail of boot prints, and the brass button that now rested quietly in the sheriff's pocket. It was probably nothing, but probably was a poor foundation to better town safety on. The open prairie stretched out in all directions, dotted with sagebrush and cottonwood trees that leaned slightly from years of wind persuasion. A few antelope moved in the distance, too far to chase, too graceful to bother. Somewhere above, a hawk circled with all the patience of a creature that had never paid taxes or answered to a mayor. He liked riding alone, not because he disliked people, though there were a few exceptions, but because the prairie had a language of its own, the crunch of hooves on dry grass, the rustle of wind through scrub, the occasional pop of a distant twig that could mean wildlife, or something more interesting. He passed an old homestead, abandoned now, its walls slouched inward like they'd grown tired of standing. A rusted plough sat half-buried beside a fence that no longer fenced anything. He made a mental note to check land records. If anyone still held claim to it, they weren't doing much with the place. Further out, he dismounted and crouched near the ashes of a small campfire. Recent, just like Carter had said. The coals were long cold, but they hadn't been scattered, which meant either haste or inexperience. Nearby, boot prints led down toward the dry riverbed, then vanished into gravel. He followed for a while, walking Jasper on foot. The sun pressed against his neck. Sweat rolled down his back in slow, determined lines. He didn't mind. He'd worn a uniform in Georgia during the war, and the heat here had the decency not to come with cannon fire. After a mile, he found what he didn't expect, a tin cup hanging from a tree branch. It swayed gently in the breeze, catching sunlight like a signal. Someone had been here, and someone had been deliberate about leaving a trace. He pocketed the cup, remounted Jasper, and sat still for a long minute, just listening. No bird song, no snapping twigs, just the prairie pretending to be empty. He turned back. The trail was cold, but the signs were enough to keep in mind. Whoever had camped out here wasn't just passing through. They'd stayed long enough to leave clues, however small. And in his experience, anyone who stayed on the edge of town without making themselves known was either watching or waiting. Neither was especially comforting. By the time he reached town again, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across Main Street. Children chased each other past a general store. A man tuned a fiddle from the saloon porch. All the familiar sounds of a town that believed itself safe. He hoped it still was. He dismounted, gave Jasper a pat of thanks, and handed him off to the stable boy. The tin cup clinked softly in his saddlebag. An unanswered question, light as air and heavy as worry. The fire crackled low, more embers than flame now, but it gave off enough heat to keep the chill at bay. Evening on the prairie came fast and sudden. 1 minute the sky was painted in streaks of gold and rust. The next it was all soft blue shadows and the first hints of stars. Around the campfire sat 5 souls, including the sheriff, each tucked into their own patch of grass or worn canvas. No one spoke for a while. Out here, silence wasn't awkward, it was polite. He'd stopped by the homestead at sundown halfway back into town when he noticed the flicker of firelight tucked behind a rise. The Weller family, new settlers, 6 months in from Tennessee. They'd staked a claim on a modest patch of land, half wild, half hope, and had been coaxing it into something resembling a farm ever since. Mr. Weller was a quiet man with a back like a barn door and hands that looked like they'd been carved from oak. His wife, Marion, had more grit than most men he'd met, and the best biscuits this side of the Arkansas River, though she swore they were just passable. Their 3 boys sat cross-legged near the fire, each with a piece of dried meat and a stick they were either chewing or sharpening. It was hard to tell which. The sheriff took his coffee black, out of a tin cup that had seen better decades. It tasted like burnt dirt and comfort. Marion handed him a plate with a hunk of cornbread and a scoop of beans that steamed in the cold night air. "You eat or you ride hungry," she said. Frontier hospitality had its own rules. He nodded his thanks, tipped his hat slightly, and leaned in toward the fire. Stories eventually began to unspool, slow and thoughtful. Mr. Weller told of the journey west, the river crossings, the axle breaks, the night his youngest got spooked by a lightning storm and tried to crawl under a mule. The sheriff listened, offering the occasional chuckle or knowing grunt. He'd heard stories like this before, but each retelling was its own kind of truth, shaped by memory, weather, and the person doing the remembering. Marion spoke of the garden, stubborn as a mule and half as generous. The boys argued over who'd seen a wolf near the chicken coop. The sheriff didn't mention it was likely just a skinny dog. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way their voices danced in the firelight, weaving a kind of fragile safety out of shared experience. Someone asked if the sheriff had ever been shot. He paused, then answered, "Not today." That earned a quiet laugh. He told a few stories of his own, mostly harmless ones, about a man who tried to rob the saloon using a carrot carved to look like a pistol, or the time he'd arrested a goat for disorderly conduct. The children howled. Even Marion cracked a smile. Above them the sky filled with stars, sharp and steady. The fire dimmed, the coffee cooled, and conversation settled into the soft rhythm of fire pops and occasional yawns. Out here, a campfire wasn't just warmth. It was community, a small flickering rebellion against the vastness of the dark. The sheriff stood at last, returning his cup and tipping his hat to the family. "You're doing fine out here," he said to Weller. "Keep the fire lit. Keeps more than cold away." He walked back to Jasper in the dark, guided only by moonlight and memory. The ride home was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. By the time he reached the edge of town, the lanterns were being extinguished one by one. Another day nearly done. Another patch of land held together by hard work, hot beans, and firelight. The wind had changed overnight. He noticed it the moment he stepped out onto the porch of the jailhouse just after dawn. The usual breeze from the west, dry and indifferent, had shifted, now coming from the north with a chill edge to it. It wasn't just cooler, it carried something different, a scent of ash, of wet earth, of distance. He'd long since stopped ignoring his instincts. In his younger years, he'd chalk things like this up to imagination, a trick of light or wind or an overactive sense of consequence. But time and the job had taught him that subtle changes meant more on the frontier. A stiff wind might not mean a storm, but it meant something. He made his rounds as usual that morning, but the easy rhythm of the day was already off kilter. At the livery, a stable boy mentioned that one of the feed crates had gone missing overnight. Just vanished. No lock broken, no fence disturbed. Just gone. Maybe a trader passed through, the boy offered. Traders tend to ask first, the sheriff said. Over at the general store, Mr. Penner, who measured everything twice and still managed to be short on flour, reported seeing fresh boot prints behind the storage shed. Not his own, not his wife's. They led into the alley and vanished behind a stack of crates. He hadn't followed them. Said something about a bad feeling in his gut. That got the sheriff's attention. Penner wasn't the jumpy sort. At the telegraph office, a message had come in late the night before, a relay from Wallace County. A supply wagon never made it to their station. No sign of ambush, but no sign of anything else either. Just an empty trail and a rutted path that led to nowhere. It wasn't enough to make a case, but it was enough to make a man uneasy. By mid-morning he'd made a slow walk around the full edge of town. He stopped by the back gate near the creek, where the grass had been flattened in a way that suggested someone, or something, had passed through recently. No prints, just bent blades of prairie grass and a single thread of blue fabric caught on a broken fence post. He folded it gently, placed it in his pocket beside the brass button from the day before and stared off into the tree line. It could be coincidence. It could also be preparation. Back at the jailhouse, he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, bitter and too hot, and stared at the map tacked to the wall. It was a simple map, hand-drawn, yellowing around the edges. It showed the town, the ranches, the trails in and out, and all the places someone might try to hide if they were clever and quiet. Someone, somewhere, was moving. Not loud enough to be noticed, but not careful enough to disappear. The sheriff rubbed his thumb along the edge of the map and thought about what was coming. Trouble in the West didn't always ride in with guns blazing. Sometimes it crept in on tired boots and unasked questions. Sometimes it looked like a missing feed crate or a thread of fabric stuck on a fence. And sometimes it just rode in under a different name. He sat back in his chair and watched the door, feeling the stillness of the room settle around him like dust. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. He was halfway through patching a loose floorboard in the jailhouse when the commotion started. Raised voices, heavy boots, the unmistakable scrape of a chair shoved too hard against saloon planks. All the ingredients of a good old-fashioned problem bubbling up on Main Street. The sheriff stood slowly, dusted off his knees, and strapped on his holster with the same care a man might use to lace his Sunday boots. There was no rush. If it was going to be real trouble, it would wait. If it wasn't, it would fizzle like most fires do when they run out of air. He stepped out into the street to find a crowd already gathering in that familiar half-circle, the one people formed when they hoped for a story, but didn't want to be in it. The saloon doors swung gently as a man stepped through them, broad-shouldered and sun-leathered, with a rifle slung across his chest and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Across from him stood Amos Denny, a rancher known more for his temper than his tact, gripping a shotgun like he meant to prove something he hadn't thought all the way through. They stood 10 paces apart, postured like it was a duel, though neither had the skill nor the patience for formality. The air between them crackled, not with violence, but with stubbornness. The sheriff sighed. He walked straight into the space between them, boots crunching on dry earth, the kind of calm in his step that didn't ask permission. He didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He just stopped at the centre and looked first at the stranger. "Name?" he he asked, like he was taking inventory. McKibben, the man said after a moment, passed through last spring. The sheriff nodded, as if McKibben were a misplaced package finally returned to sender. Then he turned to Amos. What's the grievance? He says I sold him a sick steer, Amos snapped. Claims I knew it too. Did you? Course not, Amos huffed. Did you give him his money back? No. Why not? Because I already spent it. The sheriff turned back to McKibben, who looked ready to spit a nail. You got any proof it was sick when you bought it? McKibben hesitated. It died 2 days after I got it back to camp. The sheriff gave a slow nod, like a teacher listening to a half-formed excuse. That's not proof, friend. That's livestock. The crowd chuckled quietly, grateful for the release of tension. The sheriff held up a hand. Here's what happens next, he said. You both walk away. You both go cool off. And if either of you draws that weapon again inside town limits, I'll personally see you in a cell so cold you'll beg for summer. They stared at each other, still locked in whatever silent argument had brought them here. But something shifted. McKibben slung his rifle back over his shoulder. Amos lowered his shotgun, grumbling something into his beard that might have been agreement. Good, the sheriff said, stepping aside. Now shake hands, or at least try not to punch each other again. They didn't shake, but they did part ways. The sheriff watched them go, then turned to the onlookers. Next time someone thinks about settling things with bullets, remind them we still have words available. A few people chuckled, someone clapped. The moment passed, and the town slipped back into its rhythm. The sheriff walked slowly back to the jailhouse. Another gunfight avoided, another hour bought with reason instead of lead. He preferred it that way. By supper time, the sun had begun its slow retreat behind the prairie, casting long gold shadows across the clappered buildings and turning the dust in the street to warm, floating embers. The town moved slower in the evenings, not tired exactly, just resigned to the day it had already lived. The sheriff hung up his coat, set his hat on the hook by the jailhouse door and stretched his back with a quiet crack. Then, as he did most nights, he walked the 3 blocks to Miss Delaney's boarding house, a large, creaky structure painted pale blue, with a porch that sagged in the middle like it had seen too many conversations and not enough carpentry. Miss Delaney had run the boarding house since her husband passed 8 years prior. She claimed not to miss him, though she did keep his portrait hanging above the mantel, mostly to scare off suitors. He looked stern enough to keep the gravy warm, she once said. Dinner was served family style, and anyone with coin, manners, or a badge was welcome. Tonight's table was full, a travelling book salesman with a moustache too large for his face, a school teacher who'd taken up temporary residence while her roof was reshingled, and a pair of ranch hands who were both named Tom and constantly confused about which one owed the other money. The sheriff sat near the end, his usual spot close to the window and within reach of the biscuit plate. The food was simple: roast beef, carrots that still tasted faintly of dirt in the best possible way, mashed potatoes that had the texture of memory, and gravy that could have ended feuds if bottled. Miss Delaney moved like a general among soldiers, doling out seconds and correcting posture with equal authority. When she passed the sheriff's chair, she gave him an approving glance. "You look tired." "I am tired," he replied. "Good. That means you earned your meal." The table buzzed with stories, mostly harmless ones. The book salesman tried to sell a dictionary to one of the Toms, who claimed he already had one but wasn't using it at the moment. The teacher spoke about her students with the fond exasperation of someone who truly cared, and Miss Delaney told a long, winding tale about her neighbour's cat and the mysterious disappearance of a pie. The sheriff didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to keep things orderly, and besides, he liked to listen. Listening, he'd found, often told you more than questions ever could. Outside, the sky turned a deep indigo, stars beginning to show themselves one by one like shy performers behind a curtain. The lamp on the table flickered gently, casting soft shadows against the wallpaper, the same pattern that had been there since before most of the town had arrived. He sipped coffee with his dessert, apple pie, warm and imperfect, and let the warmth settle into his bones. For a moment the weight of the day lifted. No disputes, no missing crates, no ghosts of gunfights passed. Just food, flickering light, and the quiet satisfaction of having kept the town upright for one more turn of the sun. After the dishes were cleared and goodbyes exchanged, he stepped back out into the night. The air had cooled, the dust had settled, and the windows of the town glowed softly, one by one. Another day behind him, another dinner earned. The letter was waiting for him when he returned to the jailhouse, tucked beneath the edge of his blotter like a sleeping dog curled up in the shade. He recognized the envelope before he even picked it up. Pale cream paper, handwriting neat but slightly slanted, postmarked from Missouri. From his sister. He sat down slowly, lit the lantern with a match that flared more than it burned, and held the letter for a moment in both hands. The last time she'd written had been spring, or maybe late winter. Time blurred when you spent your days counting footsteps instead of calendar pages. He opened it carefully like it might crumble in protest. The folds were tight, precise. The writing inside was clean, no crossings out, no corrections. His sister had always written like she cooked, orderly, with an eye for detail and not a lick of extravagance. The letter spoke of the farm. The hens were laying well. The neighbour's boy had broken his arm falling from a hayloft, then demanded it be signed by everyone in the church. A cousin had married, another had moved north, and a local merchant had caught fire to his own beard while trying to light a cigar and lecture a mule at the same time. There was a paragraph about their old dog, Lucy, passed peacefully under the porch after 14 good years and too many stolen biscuits. That part made him pause, and near the end, tucked between weather reports and polite inquiries about his health, she'd written one small sentence that stayed in the air like smoke. I heard from Margaret. Margaret. He hadn't thought of her in months, hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. Back when he'd worn a different kind of badge, the military sort, and his life had seemed destined for fields and letters and wedding bells. But the war had come, and the bells had rung for someone else. No details were given, just the mention, enough to stir something he thought had been buried under the dust of duty and distance. He folded the letter back carefully, returned it to its envelope and set it aside with a quiet reverence. Not sadness, exactly. Just the familiar weight of memory settling back into his chest like a well-worn vest. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rustling the jailhouse shutters and whistling through the gaps in the wood. He poured himself a small cup of what remained of the coffee from earlier, bitter and tepid now, but grounding. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, where a lone moth circled the lantern's glow like it had a question it wasn't quite ready to ask. The mail didn't come every day, and when it did, it rarely brought good news or bad. Mostly bills, announcements, and appeals for patience from distant bureaucrats. But every once in a while it carried something heavier, a name, a memory, a reminder that somewhere beyond the prairie, beyond the rail lines and telegraph wires, his life still had echoes. A family, a past, and occasionally a letter with his name on it. He didn't need to write back right away. Some things, like feelings, needed time to settle in the dust before they made sense again. For now, it was enough to know he hadn't been forgotten. The moon had risen high over Main Street, casting the town in a silver hush that softened even the sharpest corners. Rooflines and chimneys stood like quiet sentinels against the night sky, and the familiar buildings, the saloon, the general store, the church with its eternally pealing steeple, all looked gentler somehow, as if the darkness had forgiven them their daily noise. The sheriff stepped into the street with his coat buttoned and his hat pulled low. Night patrol wasn't strictly necessary in a town this size. But he did it anyway, every night. Not because he expected trouble, though trouble had a habit of showing up when least expected, but because walking the streets reminded folks that someone was still watching, still caring, even after the lamps were blown out. His boots tapped against the packed dirt, echoing faintly in the still air. Most of the lanterns were out, save for a few flickering glows behind curtained windows. Someone was reading late. Someone else was probably cleaning a rifle by lamplight, not because they needed to, but because they liked the feel of the familiar. A dog barked in the distance. Once, then fell quiet. The wind had settled into a low, steady sigh through the alleys and along the clapboard walls. Even the horses in the stable seemed to sense the hour, shifting just enough to let him know they were awake, but not enough to protest the peace. He passed the boarding house. A single candle still glowed in Miss Delaney's upstairs window. Likely she was finishing her bookkeeping, or writing another letter to her sister back east, in which she'd exaggerate the size of every storm and understate the volume of every gunfight. Near the saloon, the piano let out a single ghostly note, probably a loose key settling with the cool air, but enough to raise an eyebrow. He stepped inside just to be sure. Empty, save for the barkeep asleep in a chair with his hat pulled over his face. A glass sat half full on the counter, a bottle beside it, untouched. The sheriff considered pouring himself a sip, then thought better of it. He left a matchbook with a note that just said, "Lock the back door." Back outside, he walked the length of the street again, stopping by the telegraph office, which sat dark and shuttered. The wires above stretched taut in the moonlight, carrying news from places he'd never visit again. Some nights he imagined messages still travelled even after the machines had gone silent. Ghost letters, riding steel threads through the air, too late to matter and too stubborn to stop. He made one last stop at the jailhouse, checking the locks, flipping through the logbook. Nothing new, nothing pressing, just the faint creak of the building as it settled into sleep. Outside, Main Street lay still beneath the moon. It wasn't silence, not exactly. Just the deep kind of quiet that towns like his earned at the end of a long day. A quiet made of soot and supper and decisions not acted on. He stood in the centre of the street for a moment and looked up. The stars had come out in full, dusting the sky like someone had spilled salt across a black tabletop. The prairie had its own kind of religion, and the heavens were its stained glass. He tipped his hat to no one in particular, then turned back toward the jailhouse, footsteps steady, heart still. The town would sleep well tonight, because he always walked when the moon was high. It was just past midnight when the knock came, not loud, not hurried. 3 steady taps on the jailhouse door, the kind of knock that didn't need to announce trouble but didn't hide from it either. The sheriff set down his ledger, half filled with uneventful notes from the evening patrol, and stood slowly. He slid his Colt into the holster with the practiced quiet of a man who didn't need it often but preferred to be polite to the possibility. He opened the door to find young Jacob Cartwright standing there, breathless, hat in hand, hair sticking up like he'd run straight through his own barn. "Sheriff," he said, "it's Emery Briggs. He's back." Emery Briggs hadn't been seen in nearly 5 months. Last anyone had heard, he'd lit out after selling a wagon load of stolen mining tools to a trader out near Dodge. Never got caught, but everyone knew, and everyone figured he was smart enough to stay gone. "Where?" the sheriff asked. "Back of the feed store," Jacob said. "Near the stables, saw him duck in after dark. Didn't knock, didn't say a word, just there." The sheriff nodded once, grabbed his coat and stepped out into the cool night. The stars were still out, still steady, but the breeze had shifted again. He could smell something faintly sour in it. Sweat, maybe. Or tension. They walked the back alley slow, lantern dimmed, boots soft on the dirt. The sheriff didn't bother calling for backup. The last time he'd needed help to arrest someone, it was because they were drunk, naked, and stuck halfway through the window of the dress shop. He rounded the corner of the feed store, hand resting near his sidearm, eyes already adjusted to the dark. There, beside a stack of empty grain sacks, sat Emery Briggs, thinner than before, his coat more patch than fabric, chewing on something that may once have been jerky. He didn't look surprised. "Evening, Sheriff," Emery said, calm as a prayer. "Didn't expect to see you back," the sheriff replied. "Didn't plan on it," Emery said, "but my luck's run out most other places." The sheriff studied him for a moment. No weapon in sight, no twitch in the hands, just the worn-out sag of a man who tried to outrun something and found it waiting at the next stop. "I got 2 charges waiting for you," the sheriff said. "One for theft, one for skipping town mid-questioning." Emery nodded. Fair enough. They walked back in silence, Emery with his hands behind his back, not bound, just respectful. The sheriff didn't cuff men who didn't give him reason. Inside the jailhouse, he unlocked the left cell. Clean sheets, water jug still half full. Emery stepped in without a word and sat on the cot, back straight, like he was waiting for a sermon. The sheriff locked the door, then pulled the chair from his desk and sat facing the cell. "Anything I should know?" he asked. Emery shrugged. "Nothing I haven't already regretted." That was enough for now. The sheriff wrote the arrest into the logbook, his pen scratching softly through the quiet. Another name, another night. Emery lay down without a sound. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering down Main Street like it had somewhere else to be. Inside, everything was still, and justice, slow, quiet, and deliberate, had gone and done its job. The jailhouse had a particular kind of stillness in the hours before dawn. Not silence, exactly. The wind still creaked the rafters. The iron stove let out the occasional soft tick as it cooled. Emery Briggs snored, though not in an offensive way. More like a tired man exhaling the weight of a long, crooked road. The sheriff sat at his desk, one leg crossed over the other, eyes half-lidded but not yet closed. He wasn't asleep, not really. Just resting in that quiet space where the mind floats. Not quite alert, not quite wandering. A place where no new trouble had arrived yet. The logbook sat open in front of him, ink still drying on the last entry. Briggs, E, brought in without incident. He liked that phrase. Without incident. It meant no blood, no shouting, no rattled townsfolk. It meant the badge had done its job, and so had he. The stove gave a soft pop. The sheriff stood and added a piece of kindling, more out of habit than need. Warmth helped keep the air from feeling too empty. He poured the last of the night's coffee. Thin, bitter stuff by now, but familiar. The kind of drink that reminded a man he was still awake, still tethered to the world, even as it slept around him. He glanced toward the cell. Emery had curled onto his side, hands tucked beneath his chin like a boy at the end of a long day. Whatever trouble he'd stirred, whatever roads he'd taken to get here, it could wait until morning. The law didn't require cruelty, just consistency. The sheriff leaned against the doorframe and looked out into the night. Main Street lay in stillness, touched by silver moonlight and framed by shadows. A dog barked once, far off, then settled. The prairie wind had softened, its edge worn smooth by distance. He thought about writing a letter, maybe to his sister, maybe to no one in particular, but he let the idea drift away. The words would come later. For now, it was enough to breathe and be. The stars had shifted slightly. He could tell by the position of Orion, rising higher over the livery roof. He'd learned constellations as a boy, tracing them with a stick in the dirt while his father pointed them out. Back when nights were less about patrols and more about possibility. He sat again, boots up on the low stool, revolver unbuckled but within reach. Not from fear, just readiness. This, he thought, was peace. Not the loud kind people cheered for, not the triumphant kind written about in papers, but the quiet kind, earned, maintained, guarded without fanfare. A man in a cell sleeping off his past, a town holding its breath until morning, and a sheriff, older than he felt and younger than he looked, keeping watch until the sun remembered to rise. The first light crept in slow, painting the floorboards gold one slat at a time. It slid under the door, stretched across the room, and touched the sheriff's boots just as he blinked awake for good. Not startled, not groggy, just aware. He rose, stretched, and rubbed his face with both hands. The stove had gone cold. The logbook sat closed. Emery was still asleep in the cell, one arm slung off the cot like he didn't quite believe he was back behind bars. The sheriff took a moment to look around the room. Everything was as it had been the night before. His desk, the keys hanging from their nail, the wanted posters fluttering slightly in the morning breeze slipping through the window's cracked pane. It was a new day, but not a different one, and that, strangely, was a kind of comfort. He stepped outside and stood on the porch, breathing in the prairie morning. The town was just beginning to stir. Smoke curled from chimneys. Someone banged a pan 2 houses down, likely Miss Delaney letting her boarders know that biscuits didn't wait for the lazy. A rooster crowed with the dramatic flair of a creature who believed it held dominion over time itself. The sheriff took his usual walk, past the blacksmith's where Mancrick was already stoking his forge, past the saloon, its windows dusty, its porch freshly swept, a gesture of nightly forgiveness, past the schoolhouse still locked, with chalk dust visible on the inside sill, the only clue to yesterday's lessons. At the edge of town he paused beside the well and dipped a ladle into the cool, iron-rich water. It tasted of stone and silence, and somehow that too was familiar. He walked back slowly, not because there was anything wrong, but because there wasn't. The kind of slow that you only allow yourself when you know things are in place, and nobody's shouting yet. When he returned to the jailhouse, Emery was awake, sitting up, rubbing his eyes, looking a bit like a man who had just remembered what consequences feel like. The sheriff poured him a tin cup of water, passed it through the bars and said nothing. Emery drank, nodded once in gratitude and looked down at his boots. There would be a hearing in a few days, maybe a fine, maybe more, but that could wait. The law was patient. He hung his hat on the peg and sat back at his desk. Outside, the town moved into motion. Wagons creaked, children shouted, boots clapped against boardwalks. Life, repeating its gentle riot. He pulled out the logbook and began a fresh page. New date, new line. The sheriff's work was never done. Not in the dramatic way, but in the way fences need mending and porches need sweeping. The quiet kind of work that held the West together when no one was looking. Another sunrise, another day, and for now at least all was well.